Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you my updated favorite horror books that I have read over the past few years. And a couple years ago, I did a list of my top 10 horror. This time I'm coming back with a top 15. I love a good top 10 list, but hopefully no one's complaining that I decided to add an extra 5 books. And I like to think that I've made enough changes to this list that is not too repetitive from my last one. And so definitely if you want to check out the original list, I'll have that link down below and in the cards. But today I'm here to talk about what I'm loving right now. I always give myself a few rules for this list, so I don't include any short stories, and I also try to avoid novellas, although there's one book on this list that's kind of short, so I'm hoping it's not technically a novella. I always call it a novel. We'll get to that soon. But I'm also going to exclude books that I read for the first time this year because I like to avoid recency bias, and also kind of gives away my end of the year titles if I just tell you it all now. But I hope that you all will enjoy this. Hopefully you stick around. If you love horror, definitely subscribe. All that being said, let's get started. First, at the number 15 spot, we have The Caretaker of Lorne Field by Dave Zeltzerman. And this is a very short novel, which I'm again hoping is not a novella, but this is the story of a man who in his family, everyone in the male side has been tasked with taking care of this field, and they are paid by this town to do this job. They believe that the contents of this field are filled with weeds that will take over the world if they are left to their own devices. However, we also get to see the story from the rest of the townspeople who kind of see this man as just a crazy old kook. But we also see from his perspective that, well, things appear to be more horrific than the outside see. So I love this book because for me, it is like pretty much the perfect horror book in terms of the setup. I love that the way that you read the story or how you think about it is really going to depend on which perspective you believe. And so I love the unreliability of this one. Again, I think it's actually a fairly simple story in nature, but it's so well done. I think it's a perfect book to give to someone who's just getting into horror and really wants to experience how smart horror can be and how it has this like really tight narrative, and at the same time it's a lot of fun. You are going along and wondering, well, they just seem like a bunch of weeds, but maybe they're not, but maybe they are. And I enjoyed going for the ride. I think it's just a pretty perfect little book, and I do recommend it. It made my list, and hopefully you'll check it out. Next, at the number 14 spot, we have Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler, and this is a vampire novel that follows a young black girl who wakes up without her memories. She finds out soon enough that perhaps she is a vampire, and the story goes from there. This is one I really like, despite saying that I don't like vampire stories. I actually have a few on this list, which really does surprise me, but I think I like this one because it really just moves away or shifts away from the classic tropes of the genre instead to something very different. It pulls in almost some science fiction elements, which I love. This book definitely gets a lot of hate online, or at least it often gets very misunderstood because the fact that this is a young girl at the center of the story. She is young in terms of body, but she has an older mind, and there are sexual relationships within this book, which is going to really give people the creeps when they read it. Don't get me wrong, it was uncomfortable to read, but I do think it's done on purpose. Again, there's a lot of social commentary surrounding the choices that she makes in this book, and I think it's very nuanced. I think you're supposed to be bothered by it, and it really makes good commentary on how Black women are perceived, but also the vampire genre in general, which tends to really sexualize the individuals, especially the women. And so I do really like what this book is doing. But yeah, it's not for everyone. I love it because it's so different. I love it because it's disturbing and messed up, and that's kind of up my alley if you know my channel. But yeah, this one's really special. It's really different. I love her writing in it, and it really made me fall in love with Octavia E. Butler's work. It was my first one by her, and it definitely has not been my last. Then at number 13, we have Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, and this is such a classic story, but if you don't know, it follows a couple that move into an apartment building that seems too good to be true. They start to meet the neighbors, and the neighbors are really weird. Soon enough, the woman becomes pregnant, and the neighbors just get stranger and stranger. I read this book for the first time without having watched the movie. I really did not know anything about the plot, and it was a really fun way to go through this book. I'm also incredibly grateful that I was not pregnant at the time I was reading this, because this book would have freaked me out so badly, but I think it's really well done. Again, I tend to prefer a lot of horror that is short and sweet, and this one is very simple in terms of what it's doing, and it plays on a trope that I think has been copied many times since then, but I really love the original. I think it is so well done. I love the climax. I just like laughed when it happened. I don't know if you're supposed to laugh, but I thought it was amazing how the last chapter goes down, and I just adore this book. And so again, if you're a fan of the movie or you haven't seen it, I definitely think that the book holds up on on its own and highly recommend it. It's a classic, but for a very good reason. And then at number 12, we have I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And this is a story that is about vampires, but they act perhaps a bit more like zombies in terms of how they behave. And so in the story, we follow a man who is supposedly the last man on Earth. He is in his house trying to survive, and there are these zombie-like vampires scratching at the door, and he's left to his own devices to try to survive and try to figure out what is going on. I fell in love with this book because of the main character. He's definitely like a manly man, and maybe he'll rub some people the wrong way, but I loved him because he was so determined to find a scientific, sound explanation that was logical as for the reason that these vampires exist. You know that there is some kind of plague or virus that has taken over the world. However, it just seems very strange that these people that have been infected by this virus are acting in certain ways that seem like they're vampires. So they're bothered by crucifixes and garlic, and it just makes no sense to this guy. So I love it because I'm a huge skeptic myself, and so I'm always drawn to narratives that kind of lean into that and kind of poke fun at the genre at the same time. I, again, say that I don't like vampire stories, but these ones really don't feel like vampires. They're not very sexualized, and instead they just kind of act as more a mob mentality, and I like that idea of them just clawing at the door. And of course the story goes from there. But yeah, again, this is a classic that I really connected with. I found to be haunting and just left me with like a feeling of like isolation and sadness, maybe. It has a really powerful ending. I think it's very well done. And again, it's very different from the movie, so definitely go check out the source material. Then at number 11, we have Red X by David Demchak. And this is a horror novel that is set in, I believe, the like 70s in Toronto, Canada. And we follow a group of individuals, some gay men that appear to be going missing. At first, no one is really concerned because the police aren't taking it seriously and they just assume that these men have run off. However, because this is a horror novel, you start to wonder if there's actually a supernatural reasoning behind it. This book, as you can probably guess, is really drawing from real life events, and the author himself, who is an openly gay man, really writes himself into the story in a very interesting way. So this book feels very meta because you have the story that is taking place, and then the author stops the story at certain points and talks about his own life, and he brings in information that I believe to be true, but again, he brings it into this fictionalized story. And so I really like that it kind of breaks the wall between reality or fact and fiction, and it just was like a psychological head-spinning novel that I really love and respect, and it's one that I have to read over and over again because I'll be honest, the first time it kind of went over my head and I had to read it twice before I really started to see the pieces come together. But it's so smart, it's so unique, it is cutting and raw, it has great representation, but also a really terrifying story underneath. It was so creepy, it messed with me. I couldn't put the book down. Highly recommended. It's so freaky, it's so unsettling, and I think again it's because of the fact that it has that authenticity to the story that makes it work just so well. Now, cracking into the top 10, we have The Reaping by Bernard Taylor. And this is a story of a man who works as an artist. He gets the opportunity to go and paint a portrait of a young woman. So he goes off and he does the job. The people there are really weird, but he does the job and then moves along and goes back home. However, after the fact, he finds out that there was more going on, and the story goes from there. This is one I'm purposely not giving away too much of the book because it feels like the kind of book that is most fun to read and discover for yourself the first time around, because it has a lot of secrets and twists and turns. And I will be honest, it's a slow burning story, and at first I was reading it the first time and really wondering, well, what is going on? What's actually happening? Or is anything ever going to happen? Because it does have a slow start, but I actually think that that works really well in the case of this book because it's all about the slow build. And I think again, it's a bit more classic in terms of the time that it was written, and so it doesn't really lean into the fast-paced slasher action stories that we often see today. Instead, it reads a lot more like what we probably consider suspense, where it's all about the build and you know something's wrong, you know it's not right, but you just can't put your finger on it. So if you love movies and books in that style where you're watching and you're disturbed but you don't know why you're disturbed, that is the kind of experience I had with this book. Again, you're going to notice a lot of themes on this list where this one once again is very short and sweet, and I think it packs a great punch with a really powerful ending. And yeah, I loved it a lot. I don't think it's a book that's unpredictable, you'll never see it coming, but I had so much fun getting there and it was just a blast from beginning to end. And then at number 9, we have The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, and this is a story of two gay fathers who are going off to to their vacation home with their young adopted daughter. They are there when a group of strangers show up and say that they need their help. The world is ending, and the story goes from there. This is one of the most claustrophobic invasion stories I've ever read. My heart was pounding when I was reading it, and the author does not hold back. So often with these kind of stories, you read them, but you're not really worried for the characters. I was terrified reading this book, and I think it's the fact that the author did such a good job with the character work. I felt very deeply for them. I was very concerned, and because they were such well-developed people, they really felt like someone that I knew very quickly on. And again, it's a relatively short book, but I like that because there's no fat in this book. There's nothing I would cut out. It's just a page turner. It starts very quickly and it does not stop. And people have mixed feelings about the ending. I personally think it's perfect for this book, and it's definitely one I want to read and recommend constantly because it's definitely my kind of horror book and one that I just love. Check out. Then at number 8, we have The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, and this is a horror story that follows a family that are going to go live in a house that was previously occupied by the man's father. They are going to this home to get kind of a fresh start. Their son has had trouble in his past school. You find out that he possibly has some kind of supernatural-ish abilities, and the story goes from there. It's told in multiple perspectives, so we get to find the perspective of each of the family members. And this is a story that I love the themes, I love the story, I love what it was doing. Again, one that I want to explain why I loved it so much, but it kind of gives away a lot of the plot. If you know my taste in books and you've read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of you recommended it to me, and I'm so glad I took you up on it because I love this one. This one has some great conversations and theming surrounding family. It is just a very beautiful, emotional story, and it's also very harrowing at the same time because a lot of the major themes really surround generational abuse and trying to break the cycle, and it is powerful. So if you're someone who loves a family-driven story, but also a horror story that is scary and unsettling and has characters, again, that are very well developed. They're not perfect, they're not cut out cardboard people, but instead feel very real. This is one that you definitely want to check out. Highly recommend this one. I love this one so much. I feel like it got hyped the year it came out, and I don't hear enough people talking about it anymore, so I'm trying to change that online. Then at number 7, we have Ghost Radio by Leopoldo Gout, and this is a horror story that follows a man of Mexican descent who is creating this ghost radio show in the United States, and it's meant to mimic a show that he listened to years ago back when he was in Mexico. He was involved in a car accident that hurt and killed his family, and so he is trying to recreate this as an adult. And I like this book because it is so different than most of the books I have read, and it's really stuck out in my mind. It's one that's very unsettling, and I've read several times now, and I definitely get more out of it each time I read it. This is one book that I do personally recommend doing on audio because of the fact that it has that radio aspect to the story. And so you have the story itself of this individual man and his life, but you also get the stories within the story where you have people calling into the radio show to share their ghost stories, and they are so unsettling, the stories themselves. And then you have the larger narrative. I very much admit that if you're going to read this book, you have to read the whole way through. It is very slow and meandering, and I'll admit I almost put it down the first time I was reading it because I didn't know where it was going, and I just wasn't sure if it was ever going to get there. But I'm really glad I stuck it out because obviously it's one of my favorite books. It is just so suspenseful, so creepy, so eerie, so different, and it really got under my skin by the end. So highly recommend this one. It has some good twists and turns, and by the end I appreciate everything. And again, it's one I've reread because now that I know where it's going, I just lap up every minute along the way. I wouldn't cut anything out. Everything in this book feels very purposeful, and I'm happy to wander through it with the author. Then at number 6, we have Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This is definitely due for a reread at the time recording this, so I do wonder if it will move back higher up on the list once I revisit it again. This is a story that I really don't want to give much away. It follows a family that moves to a new town, and they wander across this pet cemetery, and the story goes from there. I went into it super blind the first time I did, and I'm really glad that I had that raw experience. I did not know what I was getting myself into, and this book hit me in the feels. It definitely has an emotional punch to it, and it really was the book that made me fall in love with Stephen King. It's currently my favorite Stephen King book, and I kind of don't think any book is going to change that off of his backlist because this one is pretty special for me. And again, this book kind of floats up and down on my list depending on my memory and all of that, but it's such a good book. I think it's one of his best endings, and if you haven't read Stephen King, this is an excellent place to start. It is so good. It's worth all the hype. It's worth all the praise, and I loved it a lot. Now, finally, moving into the top 5. The first one is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and this is a book that I read for the first time in 2022, so this is one of the newer entries on this list, but this is a story of a man who is working as a Wall Street broker. He lives this like yuppie life, and he is just this terrible person because you find out that he has these horrible urges and desires to commit these terrible crimes. And then we follow him through the story as he is enacting them out. And this book is exactly what it sounds like. It's despicable, it's disgusting, it has huge content warnings for sexual assault and gruesome, disgusting violence. So definitely know yourself going into it. It's not going to be for everyone. More so, I hear a lot of people are actually turned off by the brand dropping within this book. So it's constantly referencing different brands and his elaborate morning routine and skin routine and all of that. And I find that that actually tends to turn off more readers than the actual ugly content within this book. And this book has great references to things like Genesis and Phil Collins, which always work well for me. And this is a book that I think I just really appreciate because it really feels like a reflection on this particular time and place in culture. I feel like it's taking something like The Wolf on Wall Street, that idea, and really bringing it into a horror lens. I think that this author is not for everyone. I don't even know if I would personally like to spend time with him, but I love what he does with his books. And this one is just so smart, so intelligent. I love the social commentary that's in this book. But yeah, it's definitely going to rub people the wrong way. It's one of those books that I feel like you either love or don't. And obviously I fell on the love side. This is definitely one of my top favorites, and on another day this could even be higher on the list, but I think I'll leave it here at number 5. And then at number 4 we have Tender as the Flesh, which is a dystopian horror novel that is set in a future where animal meat is no longer safe for consumption, and so rather than becoming vegetarian, the entities or governing bodies decide to allow for the production of what they call special meat, which you learn very quickly is actually the production of human meat. So we follow a man who works in one of these factories, and he is involved in the killing of these special humans that have been set aside for this purpose. And the story goes from there. You have a instance where this man is gifted a human specimen for consumption, and he doesn't immediately kill her, instead kind of keeps her around as a pet, and the story just gets weirder from there. This is a book that is going to be really hard-hitting regardless of your feelings on veganism or vegetarianism. I am still an omnivore. I do eat meat, but this is one book that really made me question whether or not I should be doing this because it was hard to handle. I remember reading this book at the same time that I was cooking up some ground beef, and I was just disgusted by what I was doing. And so I really enjoyed this book on a lot of levels. I like a book that makes me uncomfortable, that makes me feel something. You're going to notice that on this list. And this one definitely did this. This is one of the most messed up books I've ever read on multiple layers. The part that I'm telling you is just the slice of the beginning of where this goes. And so I like this one a lot. I'd love to see more by this author translated. And yeah, this one is just, can I say messed up enough times in this video? But yeah, this one's messed up, and therefore I loved it. Highly recommend it. Go check it out. And then at number 3, we have The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And this is a book that I don't even think made my list the first time. I don't know why it wasn't on there, but upon reread, I really fell in love with this book. This, of course, you know, is the iconic story of a young girl who played with a Ouija board and possibly got possessed. And then we follow from the mother's perspective as she tries to get help. She first goes to the medical fields, and when they can't help her daughter, when they can't find answers, she then goes and reaches out to a Catholic priest, and they go through the process of trying to analyze what's going on, and eventually they come to the conclusion that she is possessed, and so they begin to proceed with an exorcism. I love the story on so many levels. It involves a really creepy child. It is just a very eerie story, and I do think it works especially well for those like myself that have a Catholic background, because it definitely brings a level of authenticity to the story, because I was legitimately told growing up not to play with the Ouija board because I would get possessed by the devil. And so this book felt creepy on a level that a lot of supernatural books don't, because I tend to, again, be skeptics, don't really believe in ghosts, all of that. But this one, oh my goodness, worked so well. And I just think it's a really tight story. Again, it's more of a classic, but I do think it's aged incredibly well. And even if you've already watched the movie, I do think it's worth going back to the source material, because I think this is incredibly well done. It's so iconic for a good reason, and I absolutely love this one. And then at number 2, we have The Changeling by Victor LaValle. And this is a story of a man named named Apollo. He gets married, he has a young newborn son, something terrible happens, and he is forced to go and try to save his family within this story. This is a story that has an element of a fairy tale to it, so it really follows the tropes of a man trying to be a knight in shining armor and trying to save the day, and it plays into those fantasy elements within the story. But don't get me wrong, this book is also definitely horror. It has some really great themes and aspects to it. It has an authentic Black experience living in the United States and how that comes into play when you're dealing with the cops and things like that. This book was just everything I wanted. The character work was fantastic. The scares are real. There are some scenes that are so legitimately terrifying, at least to me within this book. I just struggled to get through them. I love the complexity of the book. I love the humor. I love the horror, the elements, everything to it. There was so much going for this book. It really did nothing wrong, and honestly definitely could have been a contender for my #1 spot. I'm putting it here, but again, on a different day, maybe it could have made #1 because I love it so much. It's definitely my favorite Victor LaValle book and made him one of my favorite authors. Highly recommend this one. If you haven't read it, it is so smart, so fun, so unique, and just like hits you in the feels. But at the same time, it's still a really good horror story. And finally at the #1 spot, yes, once again, I had to stick Nosferatu by Joe Hill up at the top. I thought about switching around just to make this video more exciting, but if I'm honest, this is still my #1 pick. If you don't know, this is a story that follows a young girl named Vic, or Victoria, that has the ability to find lost objects. She ends up getting intertwined with this bad guy named Charlie Manx, who takes away children to Christmas Land in his Rolls-Royce car. And the story is told over a few different perspectives and timelines, and it's just a gripping action story that is filled with creepy moments, with weird humor, and it's a book that I've reread over and over again over Christmases, and I think that that's why it's hard to beat as my #1 pick, because I'll be honest, while I love so many horror books, I don't always reread them because they don't always have the same punch when you read them, or rather, sometimes I just don't get more out of the story, even if I loved it the first time. But this is one I love to reread because it's just become a new favorite. I adore the characters, I adore the plot. I think it's the perfect creepy Christmas read, and yes, I read it every year, and I really hope that more people do that as well. I don't think this book is underhyped, but if you haven't read it, please check it out. It's so much fun. I've talked about it on numerous videos on my channel, so I'll try to keep it brief here. But yeah, once again, it had to make the top of this list, and hopefully if I do this video again in the future, maybe I'll try to mix it up, but it'll be tough to have anything knock this off the top spot. So that is it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And of course, I would love to hear what are your favorite horror books. They don't have to be mine, because of course this is just a subjective list. It's not meant to be objective or the rule of law, but hopefully this was fun to see. And again, if you haven't, definitely check out my original top 10, because I think there's actually been a fair amount of shifting between positions, a lot of books that dropped off from my last list and new additions on this one. So I always actually like to watch this when other YouTubers put this out and see if their taste actually changed. And if you're new to my channel and still stuck around, if you want to consider subscribing, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, you can drop a comment, even if just a little emoji like a ghost or a vampire. And if you want to help me out more, you can give this video another thumbs up. I already said that, so let's move along. And so you can hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Otherwise, I will talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye-bye.